going to go through a couple of, actually quite a few examples. Normally in class I would show you the example and have you tell me what's wrong, but I'm going to have to just kind of talk you through it with this one, or with some of these practices. So the first one is, my roommate said her philosophy class was hard, and the one I'm in is hard too. All philosophy classes must be hard. So I want you to try to think about, before we go on to the explanation, about what might be wrong here. Think about a couple of things, like how many people that they are kind of pulling this information from. It's one speaker and then her friend. If you think about the number of people that are in your classes, our class is pretty small. I think a standard philosophy class would have about 40 to 45, maybe 50 people in it. And those are probably pretty big. Or in terms of like having a large number of classes being offered. The main issue here is that two people's experiences are not enough to base a conclusion on, and that's one of the reasons. It's kind of similar in this circumstance with this example to false anecdotal evidence, or weak anecdotal evidence. One of the reasons not to base everything on personal experience, you know, one of the reasons people say be careful about that, because again, like, just because it happened to one person or you had one experience with it doesn't necessarily make it true if you don't have a lot of other things backing it up. It helps to kind of create generalizations where we make like sweeping assumptions about a whole group of people, range of classes, places, job types, based on an inadequate sample. And it's often the kind of fallacy that's responsible for creating stereotypes. This is one of my favorite ones. Animal experimentation reduces our respect for life. If we don't respect life, we are more and more tolerant. We are likely to be more and more tolerant of violent acts like war and murder. Soon our society will become a battlefield in which everyone constantly fears for their lives. It will be the end of civilization. To prevent this terrible consequence, we should make animal experimentation illegal right now. The first problem here is that animal experimentation has actually been illegal for some time, and civilization has not yet ended, so it's pretty evident that this chain of events is not going to happen, that civilization is not going to end. And I want to kind of make this point too, that it doesn't mean that you can't make a good argument for why animal experimentation should be illegal. Again, it's situational. It's about how this person is presenting the ideas in this circumstance, not the issue as a whole. This is an example of a logical fallacy. Doesn't necessarily mean that the claim itself is bad. It means that this person is going about making a bad argument for it. Problem number two is that if we believe animal experimentation, that first part, even if we believe that animal experimentation reduces the respect for life, and the loss of respect for life makes us more tolerant of violence, we could follow it until then, and then that's sort of like the spot on the hillside where it kind of stops. Like, we probably aren't going to slide all the way down to the end of civilization, and that's why this is called a slippery slope, because the idea is that it's a chain reaction, meaning that if you take one small step in this direction, it's going to end in some dire consequence that's irreversible and that you won't be able to stop. We use this a lot with news when people are reporting about like new policies and things happening. If we vote this way, if we do this, if we allow this to happen, terrible, terrible things will happen and it'll be the end of the world and all this kind of stuff. And it's okay to to use a chain of reasoning for an argument, but you have to be able to prove, like, you have to have some kind of evidence to show that this consequence could happen, not just rely on fear. And this is an example of using emotion unfairly, because with this chain of reasoning, they're just relying on people's fear, as opposed to kind of targeting that, as opposed to using any evidence. This is another one of my favorites. Guns are like hammers. They're both tools with metal parts that could be used to kill someone, and yet it would be ridiculous to restrict the purchase of hammers. So restrictions on purchasing guns are equally ridiculous. Okay, but a lot of people, like, when you hear this, it makes sense at first. We actually see arguments like this all the time, and it makes sense at first because you're comparing two things and you're like, okay, yeah, right. But there's a problem with making this kind of comparison. Guns and hammers do share certain features. They're metal, they have metal parts, they can be tools, they could potentially be used for violence. But when people are talking about like guns versus hammers, they usually are having different conversations and different debates. When we're thinking about restricting guns, we're usually talking about being able to kill large numbers of people at a distance very quickly. We're usually talking about mass violence and things like that. Those aren't really the things we're talking about when we're discussing hammers. I do not know what people discuss when they are talking about hammers, but I assume it has to do with how they're made and the price and that kind of stuff. And when it comes down to it, you can compare any two things. And that's why this is a weak analogy. And we see these all the time without necessarily catching the problem at first, because we think in comparisons. You know, I said it's important to have examples and use examples to explain yourself, because and to use visuals, because we'll always try to teach people a new thing by explaining it and then saying, for example, and then pulling something they are aware of, they already know, and trying to make a comparison to help them understand it. We learn by these kinds of comparisons. But when you're trying to compare two things to make an argument, the things you're comparing have to be, in both cases, the relevant parts of the conversation. In order to compare guns to hammers, we have to also, when we're talking about hammers, be talking about mass violence. And because we're talking about two different things, it's not necessarily fair to compare them, because you can compare any two things. Again, like if I had this drink bottle in class and it were full, maybe I could use this to ricochet it around the room. And I could say, you know, guns are like this Diet Mountain Dew bottle. Or I could say guns are like this book. You know, if I were creative enough, I could maybe use this to hurt somebody. But again, like you can take any two things and make a comparison, because they're the same color, or they have, again, like guns and hammers have the same parts. But you have to be a little bit more careful and a little bit more fair than that when you're trying to make a comparison. Just being able to compare any two things doesn't necessarily prove much if you're not talking about things that are relevant to both topics. Caldwell Hall is in bad shape. Either we tear it down and put up a new building, or we continue to risk student safety. Obviously, we shouldn't risk anyone's safety, so we must tear the building down. There's a couple of things wrong here. If you notice, it says it's in bad shape, but doesn't really define what bad means. Like, is bad that the building is caving in or that the plumbing is out? Either we tear it down or put up a new building. There's two options here. They both seem pretty like opposite ends of a potential spectrum. But there's nothing really given that's like inside that spectrum. So they neglect to say some important things, like, one, what bad means. Two, that they could repair the building or find some way to protect students from risk. They could work on the part of the building that is having a problem and use the other part of the building. You know, maybe make some updates and fix some problems instead of just tearing the building down. It's called a false dichotomy. It's one of the ones that's in the video that I ask you to watch. And they have their own examples that are good too. But it kind of sets up the situation. There are two choices. Advertisements do this a lot, where it's either this or it's that. Either you buy this product or you continue to have this horrible problem, without considering the fact that there are lots of other products out there. You set it up to seem like there's only two choices, even when there might be more. One sounds terrible, and the other one is the arguer's option. So obviously you would pick the one that sounds reasonable and not the one that sounds ridiculous. But again, it's a fallacy, because you're not presenting the situation fairly. You're distorting it and omitting other options. Even when things are often much more complex than that. Okay, so this one, I picked a controversial topic for this one. Because I kind of want to prove a point, and I picked two statements based on opposite sides. So this is abortion is something people usually feel really strongly about, one side or the other. So I want you to think about which one of these statements describes your opinion. People who think abortion should be banned have no respect for the rights of women. They treat them as nothing but baby-making machines. That's wrong. Women must have the right to choose. The other side, people who are in favor of abortion think that it's okay to commit cold-blooded murder. the main thing you might have noticed is whichever side you happen to be on, the statement that described you probably didn't sound very fair. That's probably not how you would describe yourself. And if another person was talking to you and said that that's what you think or how you feel about it, you would probably be pretty offended. And neither of these opinions described this way sound very valid or sound very fleshed out. That's a straw man fallacy. It's also one of the ones from the video. It's where you do address the other side, but you set it up to be so weak. And you're just trying to score points by knocking it down, just like a straw man is not fleshed out. And a lot easier to knock over than a real man. A straw man argument is a weak version that's easy to knock down. You're stating it, but you're wording it in a way that makes it easier for you to refute because you're not presenting the whole picture. And you're not doing it fairly. It is appropriate to respond to opposing views, but you have to think about, knocking down a view that once you've worded it unfairly isn't super impressive. So if you have to do that, then you may need to rethink either what you understand about the other side, or reconsider your stance on the issue. And it's something to be really careful of in your digital essay, because especially controversial issues people feel strongly about, we tend to do this a lot. And I noticed this error a lot in digital essays, and that's one of the things that goes against like building your credibility and being fair-minded, is not doing things like this, making sure that when you are describing the other side, that you're doing it without this supercharged, emotional, extreme language that offends the other side rather than really fleshes out what their concerns are and does it fairly. Large-scale polls were taken in Florida, California, and Maine, all states that that are on the coast. And it was found that the average of 55% of those polled spend at least 14 days a year near the ocean. So it can be safely concluded that 55% of all Americans spend at least 14 days each year near the ocean. Okay, so what's wrong here is that this is false anecdotal evidence. When the anecdotal evidence is, or when the evidence that you're using, when the sample size that you're using is non-representative, when you can't necessarily draw that conclusion to it, it's more of an exception to the rule. And it's one reason to be careful of statistics and studies. Just because there was a study conducted doesn't mean it was conducted fairly. In this case, I'm going to go back to the examples. In this case, they just sent it out to pacifists, to people that only have the one opinion. They didn't get a diverse range of people. And they're kind of assuming that this is representative of a whole country. It might even be a small, survey set. We don't know how many people are included in the United Pacifists of America newsletter mailing. But it's not a diverse range enough to say all of America. Same thing with Florida, California, and Maine for people who spend time near the ocean. If they had included Colorado or Missouri in that study, they would have gotten very different numbers. So it wasn't, a large enough, there's only 3 states here, there's not a large enough sample or a diverse enough sample. So you have to make sure that the sample they're using is large and diverse enough and actually fairly represents the conclusion that they're trying to draw. I'm just going to go over these last 2. Dogmatism and unwillingness to consider the opponent's argument. Not that anybody ever does this, especially when it comes to political things. It kind of assumes that only you can be correct, even when many other people believe otherwise, and an unwillingness to even consider what they have to say. It's kind of related to the either-or fallacy because it assumes that competing theories or perspectives can't coexist. That you're being rational and everyone who disagrees with you or everyone on the other side is biased and you're the only one being objective, or only your side is being objective. And that both sides can't be a little biased, and that both sides can't have good, solid views. It also, it can also, another example of it is suggesting that your argument is the only acceptable one within a community. So people will, when you hear people writing off with extreme language another opinion by saying, people who believe this whole opinion is inappropriate, or everything they believe is outrageous, or only an idiot would believe this. Over applying a theory at the risk of not considering gray area or individual situations. So for instance, when it comes to like welfare, assuming that welfare is completely wrong and all those who partake in it are lazy, and over applying that at the expense of not considering individual situations, or maybe your own personal stuff. So even though you accept federal financial aid for school, or would accept state aid in the case of a catastrophic accident or injury, so even though you would accept state help, other people who do it are always lazy without considering any sort of gray area or individual circumstance. Cherry picking, we talked about, is where you ignore evidence that disproves your argument or opposing views, valid concerns, and you're not being fair-minded and truthful. When you're literally like looking at all the evidence and then just picking the things that make you look right and stacking the cards in your favor. It's important to show that you've considered a well-rounded argument. It is a conversation. So when you only look at your side, you're leaving out the conversation and putting it into a vacuum. And readers will pick up on that, and it'll hurt your credibility.